My name is Kathy Collins, and I'll be co-hosting Airing Addiction with Lisa Blanchard.
No one story is the same as someone else's, but each journey is different.
Thing on the table.
Having run substance use treatment programs for over 20 years, trying to make sure that we are welcoming to all. The idea that kind of having that exposure and that affirming place, even for one person, impacts that milieu, which then can impact maybe the broader recovery community, the community at large. I mean, I really love that thought.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Airing Addiction, our first episode for September, Recovery Month. Today is September 11th, and we are excited to have a special guest with us today. So I will turn it over to my co-host, Lisa, who will introduce our guest.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I know, as Kathy said, this is Recovery Month. So we're actually doing a podcast more frequently than normal to kind of celebrate recovery and the fact that recovery is possible. And so I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, who I think is a shining example of how possible recovery is. And so today we have Jesse Chaison, who is actually our family engagement specialist at Spectrum's New England Recovery Center program. And I'll let him describe his story, but I think he's got a really powerful story to share with everybody. So thank you so much for joining us, Jesse.
My pleasure, Lisa and Catherine. Thank you for having me, and good morning, everybody.
And so, this will be pretty informal, so conversational, but really we want to start with, as much as you're comfortable sharing kind of about your own recovery story and how you got to where you are now, kind of working at Spectrum and New England Recovery Center.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. So just to briefly go back to probably age 12 is when I started drinking, smoking weed. Shortly after that, in my teen years, I found pills and harder drugs were introduced. And at first it was fun, and then it wasn't. Shortly after I graduated high school, it became more of an all-consuming, all-day affair. I had friends from high school who we would party together more innocently than anything, and they started going off to college, and I did not. And drugs and alcohol played a bigger and bigger part of my life. Right around the end of high school is when I got, right around the end of high school is when I got introduced to the legal system, as an adult. But I was already introduced to the legal system through DSS. When I was 14, 2 different CHINs, Child in Need of Services, were filed on my behalf. My parents, who I love dearly, did the best they could with me, but I was just too much to handle. I grew up with my mom and my dad and my one younger brother. And I was introduced to DSS at 14, lived with some family who became my foster parents, who became my legal guardians for a while. They also did the best they could with me, but I was, again, too much to handle there. And then shortly after graduating high school, my first introduction to the legal system was getting arrested for smoking weed on Revere Beach, which today seems ludicrous, but it happened, and it's part of my story, and things progressed from there. And, in recovery, we call moving around the geographical cure, and I tried that too. And I brought me everywhere I went. So I went to a different state, and all the people changed and all the places changed, but my behavior didn't change. So my outcomes didn't change. And I quickly got out of there after a few months and came home. And that's really when, home to, I grew up in Revere right outside of Boston. And that was really all I knew. My world was very small back then. And I stayed in my hometown for the whole summer of 2005. But I felt trapped in my hometown as well, because I was homeless. I was constantly in and out of jail, getting arrested for possession, larceny, shoplifting, stolen motor vehicle, and still didn't think I had a problem. Still thought it was just par for the course. Still thought it was acceptable. My story is one of settling for less. I heard many people in my life tell me I had a lot of potential, and I honestly thought the potential would just kick in one day. So I think it did, but it took a lot of work, and it took me getting sober to have that potential kick in. But I finally got sober at age 23. August 11th, 2009 is my sober date. And I got sober actually through a Spectrum program, but I'm sure we'll get into that. So that's just a brief synopsis. I tried to be as brief as possible to
no, it's such
incorporate.
It's such a great story, Jesse. I love it so much because it sort of encapsulates everything we do. But I was thinking you're such a example of really what recovery, you haven't even really gotten to where you are today, but what a story. And I'm just curious, and along the recovery line, at what point did you say to yourself, I want to start giving back to the people gave to you and taught you how to live a sober life in recovery? At what point did you say, this is really what I want to do, and it become part of who you are?
It's a really good question, Catherine. And I honestly didn't think about that until 2.5 years into recovery. August 11, 2009 is my sober date, and I had a lot of legal involvement. So I spent 16 months in jail. And sorry?
You were in jail while you were sober?
Sober. And
so that's possible. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. Some people don't know that, but, there's more access sometimes to people incarcerated for all the stuff that we don't need than on the street. And even, doing drug programs and that sort of thing, it's par for the course in there. So to answer your question directly, it wasn't until I graduated Spectrum and moved out on my own and took a sort of inventory of where I was in my life that I got the idea, like a lot of us do in recovery, to work in this field, to give back what was freely given to us, to be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
So I got sober at 23. I was probably 25 or 26 when I decided to make this field a career choice for me.
I love it. Yeah.
One of my favorite kind of sayings that comes out of 12-step, right, is you can't keep it unless you give it away. And, I just think that, you're such a great example of that. So can you talk a little bit? Well, we'll jump back a bit in a little bit to more of the criminal justice and how some of that stuff impacted you. But since we're on this topic, can you tell me a little bit about how working in the field and helping others kind of helps feed your recovery?
So great question, Lisa. And this is not a canned answer, I promise. I get this a lot. And for me, the way that I differentiate it is my job is to work at Spectrum's New England Recovery Center for family engagement specialist. If something in my personal recovery can benefit someone I work with, I'm going to share that with them. But I also put that first, that it's my job and it's a career. So I explain it like this. When I punch in, I put on my Spectrum hat, and I'm a good little Spectrum soldier. And when I punch out, I take off that hat and I put on my personal recovery hat, and I go out and work my personal recovery. Because for me, and just for me, and all I have is my experience to share, I've witnessed far too many people think that working in the field is their sole recovery purpose, and you can't give from an empty cup and you burn out. And in this field, if you burn out, it could potentially have some very hazardous consequences. So my personal recovery impacts every day of my work at NERC, but it also is not my only area of recovery. I do a lot of work outside of my employment with others in recovery.
That's so great, because it's so true. And I think it's such a good example when you are in the field and you're in recovery, that you're not telling people to do something you wouldn't do. Like if you say going to a meeting a day in a 12-step a 12-step meeting. If you're saying go to a meeting a day, it's nothing you would expect them to do that you haven't done or wouldn't do. So I think that it's like you're not speaking a foreign language. You can absolutely, you've walked in their shoes. And I think you have a greater gift to be able to share, like, hey, I know it works. I know this recovery thing will make your life better. That's how.
Yeah.
And I love that idea of kind of that healthy boundaries, right? Like that, your spectrum hat that is influenced by your personal recovery, but it is not all of your recovery. And that's just taking care of yourself and your boundaries and your own self-care needs. But also when you're kind of wearing your spectrum hat, for example, or your, working in the field hat, it's not your recovery. So, you're able to be open to kind of all pathways to recovery, right? Even if they're not your exact pathway.
Exactly, Lisa. So many times I feel, and I've done this before, where I try to fit others' recovery into the lens of what works for me. And I've learned in the field, I've only been working in the field a few short years, maybe 5 years in total, between Spectrum and another agency before Spectrum. But I've learned in the field that there's no one size fits all cookie cutter approach to recovery. So what worked for me may not work for somebody else. And somebody that's in treatment right now in our Westboro campus or on our Weymouth campus or doing outpatient, one of our outpatient sites, they have the right, and I have the responsibility to show them multiple pathways of recovery to see what works for them.
Love it. And I was also thinking now, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, Lisa, you can back me off if I am, but I was thinking about the family the fact that you're a family engagement, like you have experience having, and we all have a family, we all started somewhere, but my family story is different, how I got in recovery, in that I wasn't a foster child, I wasn't referred to the courts, my story is different, but I find that to be so intriguing, like, because when I think of sort of getting the courts involved and family systems involved, like they're broken families. So many people were hurt, and we read about it, we hear about it, but now more than just helping people in recovery, like I could almost cry, you're helping the families, you're repairing things. It's almost like a living amends. You can't redo everything you happened in your life, but you can help people today make their families better.
Yeah, and I don't take that lightly at all. This process of family restoration, you're exactly right, Catherine. I have my own family, and I have my own family process of restoration through my own recovery, and my mom and my dad and my brother. I love them dearly today. They all live out of state, but when we do get a chance to call or talk or FaceTime or fly down there, we do, and we spend a lot of time together. When we do that, we make it a week-long vacation or something like that. But my story is one of be careful what you wish for, because around 26, I got the motivation to go into this field, like a lot of us, I think, to help other people in recovery. It was never my intention to work with families. That actually happened at New England Recovery Center when I was a case manager, and the family engagement specialist got promoted to be my supervisor. And through her great work with families, it started making an impression on me. And when she got promoted and vacated that spot, I decided to apply for it.
And this is a sort of a technical question, but in the course of treatment with the patient and the family, when do we get the family involved? Like, can you talk about that a little bit? Like, at what point do you make a phone call and get them right involved in the patient's treatment or the client?
As soon as possible, Catherine, as soon as possible. So not to get too technical, but for those that aren't familiar with our campus, New England Recovery Center is actually in 2 different buildings. Our detox is in one building and our residential is in the other. And I had worked in the detox up until earlier this year. And when families would come in, I would meet them at the door. And when families would come in to drop off their loved one, when significant others would come in with their loved one for admission, I loved meeting them at the door, because I think I can relate to both on a different level. I would oftentimes see a lot of emotion, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. And after just nothing too deep, but after a 5-10 minute conversation introducing myself and what I do there, the family would feel like they have someone to reach out to when their loved one's there. And their loved one, I share often with clients, hey, my journey started on this campus. I got sober as a client here, just like you. So I felt like meeting them right at the door was the best case scenario. And now that I work in the residential side of things, once I still go down to the detox and meet them at the door if needed. But when someone fully detox and transitions up to our residential program, we're utilizing Zoom, we're having phone conferences, we're meeting with them right away to get the family involved.
And I think that does a couple of things, right? Like treatment can be a bit of a black box. And so people don't know what happens, right? When somebody walks in that door, they just are like, oh gosh, let this help, please. Because there's usually a very long road that gets that individual in that family to the door of treatment, right? Or it's been multiple treatments, or it's been a long road in general. So just having that kind of friendly, familiar face to connect the family to the treatment so that they have a better understanding what's happening that can help with it. But the other thing it does, and especially, when you're able to say to a family, not just to the individual in recovery, which that is so important too, right? But to a family, I started here, right? Like I have been exactly where your son or daughter or your husband or your wife or whomever the family member has been. And I'm in a very different place now. And it shows them hope, right? It gives not just the individual that's striving for recovery hope, but it gives that family hope. And that's what everybody really needs.
Exactly. We want to spread positivity. So often with this disease of addiction, the stigma and the negativity that it spreads. I heard you say it's oftentimes a long road to get somebody through that front door, and it is. And it was a long road for me. And many people along the way planted seeds and tried to help. But it wasn't until I was ready to receive that help that, if I'm honest, probably didn't happen. I gave you a very brief sort of 30,000 foot view of my early teens and early 20s. But with all that pain and trauma and suffering, it really didn't become an option for me for recovery until maybe the fall of 2009, sitting in jail yet again. I have this very vivid memory of sending a letter to my parents and writing in that letter, I admit I need help. I have a problem with alcohol and drugs. It's been taking over my life for years now. And that's kind of twofold for me, that memory, because I remember that admission, that sort of step one admission, but also the power of this disease with everything that my family and I had been through because of it. I honestly thought my parents would be surprised by that letter. Like they didn't know I had a problem, right? I was the last one to know. They knew for years. Yeah. They'd been telling me for years, you need help, kid.
They probably got the letter. Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it begs the question that I see a lot, is that, many people need multiple visits to a treatment center. And I think it's sort of, did you have multiple visits to various centers, or was it like until you were ready, you didn't even go? Because I guess the number one question I have when I'm talking to, really, it's like, and then like Lisa said, people lose hope. It's like a long road. Like, why is this going to be any different? And I always think until the person's ready, it's not going to be any different. It's just going to be, however, you're still getting the message into the person's head so that it's there when they're ready. But I'm just curious your thoughts on that as a recovering person and a person who works in the field.
So I do agree with you a lot, Catherine, that until someone's ready, there is no amount of trying that's going to help them. I often tell clients and families that being in recovery, I know that I can't fix the person. I can't cure them. I'm powerless over them. I can't make them do anything. I can't make them not do anything. My role, really, I feel all our roles in the field are to be guides to show them their options and walk with them. And to answer your question directly, Spectrum was my first residential program. There was one previous short stop at a program actually called Shortstop, which was a wayside program that is no longer there in Somerville. It was my now mother-in-law's good intention of getting me off the street when I was homeless. It was essentially a shelter for troubled youth. And I was not ready, to your point. I was not ready. And there was just more chaos and heartbreak and trauma in that few short months I spent there. But really, it wasn't until I got to Spectrum 3 days before Christmas in 2010 that I actually buckled down and took it serious for the first time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to get to kind of what about our Spectrum program, kind of still resonates with you. But one of the things I want to say before I ask that question is, just like when you're meeting with families and saying if somebody's not ready, and to build off what Kathy just said, the thing that I often will say to family members and even to individuals entering treatment is, when people get frustrated because whether there's a relapse or they've kind of had to re-enter treatment, is that none of that time was wasted. Even if you weren't in long-term recovery yet, even if it was part of your recovery path. And so like Kathy said, those messages, you heard them, you just weren't ready to actually receive them and live them. And so no treatment attempt or effort is wasted, right? It's all part of the journey. It's all, worthwhile, until you get to that place where, there's been enough and you're ready to continue down long-term recovery. But tell me a little bit about what about the Spectrum residential program kind of helped you with that shift, right? I mean, you were definitely ready. There was definitely your own approach to it. But what are things that you learned in that program that you that resonate with you, and maybe you still apply to this day?
I could go on for hours about that. But before I answer that, just to jump back to something you said, when someone does relapse, we don't, this isn't a Men in Black situation. Look at the red light, zoop, and then you forget everything you learned. We don't start over. We start from experience. And so often I find people in my personal recovery, in my professional role, that have known me in both, or even just one, and have known me multiple different times over the years. And we don't start over, we start from experience. So something along that man or woman's journey stuck with them to the point where they sought recovery again and were successful. As far as what stuck with me from Spectrum residential program, for those that don't know, watching this podcast or that will watch this podcast, that was the ball that got this whole idea rolling. When we were trying to figure out topics for this podcast, I had suggested something about the residential program because the physical building that used to house the residential program prior to our Farris Center being open, I think 6 years now. The old building was knocked down and demolished this year, and it was a very emotional time for a lot of us that had fond memories there. I myself spent 8 months there, and I called it Recovery College because of the time I had not gone to college, and really it taught me how to be an adult, how to function in society without drugs or alcohol, criminal addictive behavior, being so selfish and self-centered, just being a part of the stream of life. Everything from gender specific groups to core skills to relapse prevention to getting exposed to various methods of recovery. Something I haven't touched on yet, and I wanted to briefly touch on, was, my parents did the best they could for me. I said that. And part of that was bringing me through a faith of their own childhood and going to a private school, growing up kindergarten through 8th grade. And really, I'm the classic textbook example of rebellion from that.
Mm.
And it wasn't until I got to Spectrum that I was exposed to a similar faith, but very different as well. That, a church came in and did spirituality groups that were essentially music groups, and it resonated with me. And I started going to that church, and I became a member of that church, and I went to that church for years, and I still go to church because of that experience, and it opened my eyes up to different methods and different paths to recovery. And I know I need all the help I can get. So I met a lot of beautiful people there.
Those are wonderful memories of it, and I didn't realize that. But I'm curious. So as you know it, is the program the same today, just different location as it was when you went through it? As you are familiar with it?
Very similar. It's actually been beautiful this year to help a few of our clients who maybe need longer term treatment than we're able to provide at New England Recovery Center. I've helped a few clients get from NERC, as we call it, to the Spectrum RP of 2020. And it's been a beautiful thing to witness, because the program is still very structured the same. It's in a physical different, it's actually in two different buildings. So the physical location may be changed, a few 100 yards, but the structure itself, I talked to the staff there, and they have a phenomenal staff that really takes the time to work with the client. And, my 8 months at the residential program in 2010 and 2011 could be easily duplicated for someone in 2020 at one of our residential programs. Maybe not the exact amount of time, although I'm sure if they need it, we can make that happen. But, even 3 months in a residential program, I always tell families and clients that it's not so much the amount of time, it's making the investment in your future. Whatever amount of time you need for that, it's sort of a timeout from life to invest in your future life.
Yeah, and that was when you were there, it was all male or all female or co-ed? I mean,
it was co-ed.
It was co-ed, okay.
It was co-ed under one.
Right? So it was like the thing that's changed in the field over the past several years is more individualized approach to length of stay, right? And whereas at the point, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been at Spectrum since you were there, but the time frame was much more structured. Like everybody came in and did a 6 to 9 month residential, right?
Yes,
and now
more of a one size fits all.
Yeah. And now we have the same recovery principles, right? So just like what you just said, some of the things that you've learned, the structure, the core skills, the relapse prevention skills, those things don't necessarily change. We add layers to meet the population needs, and, becoming more, gender affirming and things that are evolving over time. But some of those core principles stay the same, but it's really more of an individualized approach, right? Some people might need, and now we're doing that, right? Might need a longer length of stay, might be the 6 to 9 month residential, stay. And some it might be, 3 months, because that's either what they need or what they can do. And I think it opens the door a bit for some folks who maybe, for whatever reason, their family, financial, whatever it might be, their reasons for not wanting a long-term residential can still benefit from that structure and a shorter stay.
Oh, of course. And this is something that I talk about with families daily. Is X amount of days, weeks, months enough time? And I was just talking to a family member this week about that. And I told this family member that it's not so much the amount of time. So often we find, to go back to what you said earlier, treatment can be this black box to people who don't know what happens behind the wall. And so often, we hear from a relative or a coworker's relative, I went to this program and did this amount of time and that worked for me. And then they get that in their head that this is the amount of time they need. And I step them away from that and say, look, it's individualized. It's what you need right now. It's what you're willing to do. Myself as the person, the staff person, I could write up a great treatment plan and it would look great on paper, but unless the person's bought into it for the amount of time that they're agreed to be there, it goes back to that. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink.
Yeah, I often hear we can't have more willingness than the patient. And believe me, sometimes I am so willing, I'll come pick you up myself and take you there and hold your hand. And it's like, okay, what's that going to do? It might make me feel better, but I can't have more willingness than the person who needs the treatment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the last piece that I like to tell families, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make them drink, but you can make them really thirsty. And over the course of time, where someone maybe is ambivalent toward recovery, or contemplative on the stages of change, it's only a matter of time before they become at least curious of what this recovery thing's all about. For my own story, I would hear people, incarcerated with me and talk about halfway houses and sober houses and programs and all this stuff. And at first it was, oh, that's just a way to get out of jail early, or that's a way to do easy time. And I became curious about it. And I'm very honored, and it's a real privilege to stay in contact with the people who helped me from behind the wall. I was now I'm gonna cry, Kathy. I was incarcerated in Billerica House of Correction, and for those who have worked in the field watching this, or even for you two on this call, so often we see the turnover in this field just happen over and over again like crazy. And it in Billerica, there's 3 people who spoke into my life over 11 years ago that still work there. My case manager, a couple other case managers, and I just called her a couple weeks ago just to say hi, just to say, hey, this is where I'm at. At my previous agency, we had an open house where my case manager, Nadina, love Nadina, she came to the open house. She met my family. She held my firstborn. It was a beautiful experience. It was not one that I thought ever possible sitting in her office in Billerica. If anything, my story is one where you don't need much willingness. You don't, if that horse analogy, if you're not interested in it, but there's like a little shred of curiosity, just do it. All the misery's there. You can go back to the lifestyle if you want, but through other people's willingness to help me, I got into Spectrum, and those staff are still there helping other people.
Well, that horse analogy I love so much, because it's making them thirsty for it, giving them hope. I'm thirsty for the hope, hearing your story, seeing whatever people have in their head of a drug addict or an alcoholic, it isn't like you're not the photo next to that, and it's like, to me, that is the hope. That is the hope. We recover. And in being Recovery Month, I think what an amazing story that you've sort of highlighted, that you've recovered to the full. Sorry, I'm muting that. There you go. Yeah, you are the depiction of hope for me. So I guess I love the way you say that. Give it a try, whoever you are out there listening to this, because that's true. You can always drink again. You can always drug again. Your misery can be refunded tenfold, but you also may have the greatest opportunity to have a life like Jesse.
And I love the piece of, of course, being with Spectrum for as long as I have, I have so much faith in our programs and appreciate what they do. But the fact that you were kind of introduced to those concepts in corrections, right? And where people think that that's not always the entry point into recovery, but it really can be, right? And there are people who can help you, while you're, behind bars, right? Like that mandated kind of treatment does help, right? It at least opens some doors. It at least kind of shines some light on what might be a different way to be, even when that's the only light that you're able to see, in a correctional setting. And there's still hope there. So I really do appreciate your perspective on the time that you've spent, in the criminal justice system, and how that's shaped your recovery and how you stay in contact. I think that is a really, really hopeful story too.
Lisa, there's always hope. There's always hope. I've seen far too many. I've seen situations that on the surface look way too impossible become possible, to not believe that there's hope for everyone that maybe would watch this one day, or maybe give Spectrum a call, or give someone else a call. It just ask for help. My story is one where I had a public defender lawyer in the jail cell below a courthouse tell me I was doing life on the installment plan because I was bouncing in and out and in and out. And I laughed at him. At that moment, that lawyer cared more for my safety and well-being and life outcome than I did. And that's the sad fact. But he was right. That's the disease. And he was right that I was doing life on the installment plan, because the charges got gradually more serious. The lengths of stay in jails got gradually more serious, and the probation, got longer, and the stipulations got longer, and I was the last one to see it. So, between that lawyer telling me I was doing life on the installment plan, and the over 2 years I spent incarcerated in my life, not all of it was motivated to change. A lot of it actually was just settling for less. Mental health plays a huge part of my story: depression and anxiety and trauma and self-medicating and all of that. So a lot of that was just going with the flow and just kind of letting the breeze take me wherever it took me. But it wasn't until really that, Nadina sat me in her office one day and said, "Do you want help?" And for whatever reason, I was a little curious. I was that horse at that water, just like not drinking yet, but like, all these people are talking about these programs. There must be something to it.
Yeah. And that's part of why, Spectrum also runs, quite a few correctional programs, in the state of Massachusetts and nationally in several other states, and why that's so mission driven for us as well. So that it's so important to be there at that time that someone's, in the system, is incarcerated, and have those conversations, right? And be able to have those conversations. And we know that treatment wherever it is, works.
Yeah, it reminds me of the fact that we also have the program Project Turnabout, which is, a longer length of stay. It helps people turn their life around that were in situations exactly like yours. It's very similar to what you described on the residential program at Spectrum. And to me, that just sounds like amazing. And people have an opportunity to turn their life around. But I was thinking, to sort of, since we're going to have to wrap soon, I was thinking about, since Lisa and I started doing this, the number one word that has come up in my mind is hope, time and time and time again. And what I was thinking as you were just sort of sharing everything is, did you ever imagine a homeless kid like you in Revere Beach who got arrested for smoking pot, which is now legal, which we could do a whole show about that too,
We could.
But that you would have a beautiful wife and 2 beautiful daughters, and you'd have an opportunity. Now, this kind of stuff is like the greatest hope ever. That it's like you probably didn't imagine it, couldn't have written it, could never have even dreamed such a big dream for yourself. But you're a husband, a father, a great employee. It's because of recovery.
It's all because of recovery. And thank you for those kind words, Kathy. Yeah. Every area of my life has been drastically, positively impacted by recovery. My marriage of over 6 years to my best friend. Now I'm getting emotional again. My 2 daughters, our oldest, it's actually her birthday today. So when I got off this call here, we're just going to love on her and just make it a special day for her. And just the opportunity to teach these girls about what daddy's been through, but also with that experience, how much more life means today. You know, no, I could not imagine this at all. I was always settling for less. I heard once that, you know, in recovery, we're so glad to get out of the gutter. We settle for the sidewalk, and our higher power has a penthouse with our name on it. But we never get there for one reason or another. And I'm nowhere near there, but you know, my story is one where it continues to grow, it continues to get better, both on the outside, professionally. I'm currently in a master's program for LMHC. I didn't like high school. I barely graduated high school. I considered Spectrum Recovery College because I thought that was the only college I'd ever go to. I found college in recovery after I made that decision to go into the field, and there was a lot of fear there, and walking through a lot of fear of not being good enough, or the damage I've done to my body, preventing me from going to school. And, you know, here's kind of where like our character defects come into play. A lot of us that got sober around the same time went back to school, and we made it almost a competition. And we all did really well. And you know, I never thought that I would be in school, do well in school, be in a master's program, any of that. But even more important than that, it's the inside job, the appreciation of life every day, the gratitude of life every day, the deep connections with people that I've made over the years, the people who knew the old Jesse before sobriety and recovery, and are still in my life today and continue to come back in my life. I had a dear friend from high school reach out, who we weren't on the greatest terms for a long time. And we spent a great day together with our families the other day, and it was all due to recovery.
It's beautiful.
So it starts from the inside, and it grows out.
It's a beautiful thing. And I just want to say thanks for spending the time with us, because
My pleasure.
My heart is going to burst. I feel this is the one part about COVID that makes me crazy, because if we were all in the room together behind a microphone, I would jump across and give you a big hug, because it just
big virtual hug.
Yeah, big virtual hug for you. So from the recovery side of things, I'm so very grateful for you having spent time with us.
And I'm just so grateful to hear your personal story, your Spectrum story, your correction story. It's all just, it's all just so hopeful. And this is exactly what we need in Recovery Month. So thank you so much for joining us. So I will end with Kathy's favorite question. And so if you happen to have, just to give back and give people kind of further things for their own recovery or those that they're working with, do you have any books, podcasts, anything that you kind of, would recommend?
So everyone on here can't see this obviously, but I'm sitting in an office literally with boxes and boxes of books right off to my right. And I often say that there are so many resources for people in recovery and people that love people in recovery. We couldn't possibly touch on all of them. Some current books that I enjoy and have blessed my life. Drop the Rock. It's a Hazelden book on step 6 and 7, which is great. The 4 Agreements is another book which has greatly impacted my life. As far as podcasts go, I've been listening to this one podcast for years out of 12-step recovery in Detroit. It's called Recovered, and it's a gentleman out there who has his own story in recovery. And every show is like a mini meeting. Every podcast is a different topic, and there's an app, and there's many different subjects to turn on the car on the right way to work. Take back that commute rather than just drinking coffee and trying to wake up. Listening to something that's gonna speak into your life. So those are some books and some podcasts that
I jotted them right down. This is my favorite topic. I love podcasts and books, so Lisa had me right there.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate it. We appreciate the early hour with the little ones getting up, on your day off, on your daughter's birthday. I hope that you have, a wonderful, blessed day. And it's been great to have you.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We'll see you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Okay.